and gentlemen, I present to you the cast and the director of Pipeline. So, was that intense or what? Yeah, okay, yeah. So I'd also like to introduce to you our facilitator for this learning exchange, Mr. Siraj Syed.
And let's have one round of applause. Just acknowledge this house that we brought into, the space that's been curated, the experience that was created by the creative director of the Actors Warehouse, Stephen Butler. So, today's exchange, what we're doing here is it's kind of a process of making meaning around what just happened, right? We've collectively experienced something, but today, that's going to be guided a little bit, and especially for the cast, I wanted to kind of introduce some of the faces in this audience because it's going to focus in on a particular concept, right? A particular concept that has been well studied this semester by many of the faces in this audience, right? Who are here as a, let me get this right, is it a Quest 1 course on someone jump in? What is madness, right? Yeah, so that is being taught by our esteemed colleague, and I want to welcome her, Nancy Hunt, professor of history All right, so let's get into that, right? So I know with this cast and with this group last week, we kind of focused in on a very broad range of perspective in terms of how you all found your way into this particular production and where you drew on for the type of emotion that you left out on the stage, brilliantly, I should say. This time around, I wanted to go with something that was, it was a moment, right? It was a moment that Cindy's character, Lori, had said during one of the final scenes. Who remembers that? Actually, I'm not going to try to say the line. What is the line again in terms of there is no protocol for
there is no protocol for war. There is stop two people from killing each other.
Yeah.
That was all.
Yeah. So that's important, right? And I think that should resonate with all of you guys because that's the idea, right? What is the protocol for how we come through circumstances that are larger than we, that are beyond what we can process as a personal experience? Because, as is the case for the character of Omari, as we saw right through the end of this production, there are facets of his life that are being dictated by years of culture, years of history, years of prejudice, bias, marginalization, oppression, whatever the case is. He's even likened to an imaginary character in a source of literature, right? And yet he has to hold accountable to that, right? So let's find our way into that kind of idea, and I want you guys to start because, and by the way, I'm saying all this and I'm pointing to you because you'll eventually be talking about this stuff too, right? So just so you know, I'll go randomly. If you're not making eye contact with me, that's who I'm going to be calling on. Right? So, thank you. So Leo, how about that, man? Let's kind of start in with that idea. The idea of really being responsible, like one person, one human being, holding accountability in front of a group of people. I mean, it's happened in the production. You had to find your own way into it to do it on the stage, right? So how does that feel? What is that? I mean, you've come closest to this character. You are this character. You've held that space as Omari. So how does that feel to even play that role, to hold that kind of burden?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Man. When I first learned I was playing Omari, like I was talking with Tariba, my co-star Tariba, like we talk a lot and like kind of bounce ideas off each other with the character and the story, you know, a lot. And I told her, I was like, man, Tariba, yo, like, I don't think I can do this. This character is so complex, like it's so complex. And the reason why it's so complex is because I mean, I could go all day to like kind of break it down to you guys, but I mean, really, it's just because this town has never seen like a show like this. It's such a powerful piece, and like thank God for Dominique Morisseau, like the playwright, who like just kind of gives it to you on a silver platter, so it makes it easy to kind of connect with it. But with Omari, like I mean, he's just a regular kid, you know. He's been thrown into a situation that he wasn't looking for. You know, he's going through a lot. He has a girlfriend, you know. He has a mom and a dad that, you know, he got thrown into a situation a little bit, which I kind of felt like I kind of took some like past, or I guess some stuff from, but he's just a regular kid trying to like live, like you said, get through the week, and he's going to the school searching for opportunity, and yet he get like, you know, this kind of side block of like the teacher coming at him, and also with his girlfriend, you know, complaining. Like I'm pretty sure, you know, you guys see how Jasmine is. I'm pretty sure she's like that all the time. So he has to deal with that all the time. So like, you know, he loves his girl. He's trying to make her happy. You know, he tries to make his mom happy. He tries to make his dad, who he wants to have a relationship with, but like it's not really connecting that way. And it speaks from a lot of like, as a black man, like I mean, I never personally. My dad has always been there in my life. Like I never had that situation, but I know someone who has. I know of a cousin. I know someone who I'm close with who can actually experience that with. So playing Omari is like, I feel like it's bigger than me because it's like, yeah, like I'm like kind of like representing the black boy, and like I mean it's that coming of age. I mean it's that coming of age to knowing how to deal with a situation like that when you don't even ask for it, and then other stuff comes behind that when you're asked other questions, and that make you go think, you know what I mean, doubt yourself a little bit, make you go crazy a little bit, make you go like, I'm not understanding. And I feel like with Omari, that was like the hardest thing because I put a lot of emotion into into the character, and it's so easy because I have been where he has, and it's so easy to just let it go. And I'm thankful for Brad for bringing the show to Gainesville. I'm thankful for Steven to allowing us to do this. I'm thankful for you guys for coming and experiencing this with us. But Omar, he's a very complex character, and I just try to take what I know from what I learned and what I've experienced and put it, give it to you guys. Yeah.
Well, I just want to say you did an amazing job. You're an amazing actor in the way you brought all that emotion forward. But I also want to say, like, my students rock. You guys can just turn the conversation around if you want. You're looking some of you are looking really tired. Like you don't want to have to speak for a while. And you can just ask them what they thought or get some opinions out, because we've basically been studying racism in relationship to madness since the 17th century. We did a whole unit on the 18th century, melancholia on slave ships. We did a lot with colonial Africa and racism there and how that affected the production of different kinds of symptoms. And this is our, you know, I mean the class, What is Madness, was really, the title really came because we're living in the era of Trump, and we get new definitions every day about what is the definition of madness. But if you want to listen, I think you'll be able to get some reactions out from my students. But it's your turn. But I just want to be.
Let's go with Brad.
Yeah, well then I'd love to ask a question. So, I mean, based on your studies and what you've seen, I think one of the interesting things that this play brings up is that there's a historical perspective to the anger that is held within these boys who fight in the school in Scene 8. And I'm just wondering, what connections do you see there, if any, to, you know, previous historical like looks into madness or into just general melancholy is a nice word, I guess, but I mean, wow, it's a melodramatic word too. But yeah, like what connections do you see to the anger that this play is trying to talk about, the madness that this play is suggesting? Anybody?
Man, all those hands. Come on, let's get them up. There is extra credit involved here. She said it. I didn't. She didn't want to say it.
Isaac O. Anyone tell me about Isaac O? Acute mania.
Great place to be. Well, let's think a little bit about kind of find our way into that, right? Listen to what Omar just, or what Leo said, but it's Omar's character. This idea that it's just life, right? You guys can relate to that. It's your background circumstances, where you've come from, how you found your way here, trying to navigate this space. It's a big school, interpersonal relationships, whatever the case is, that's all the stuff that his character is navigating. And yet, there is this entire historical precedent that is just weighing down on him. Other people are seeing him that way. They don't see him, they see it. So who feels like that? Do you guys walk around feeling like you're seen? Are there aspects of your character that aren't seen? Is that something that you can relate to in here? Or do you guys have awesome lives? What do you think? How about for you guys? Give me a sense of that. No one's looking. Just focusing here. Okay, yes, man.
I personally can't, but I have many friends from even the school that I went to, they're still in high school, that have had something like that to an extent. Like every time he travels north, for instance, he would get like dirty looks just because of his race.
Yeah.
And it kind of, I can see how it affects his life negatively.
Yeah. Why the dirty looks? What do you think? What has he said to you about it?
He just notices them, he doesn't really know why,
Yeah.
particularly.
Yeah. You know, I'll give you a perspective on that, right? It's something that I haven't necessarily shared before, but when I first came down to Florida, I made a come for grad school, and I was working in schools around the county, a lot of rural counties right around here. And I worked with families, worked with members of their household when, you know, a child was having some kind of behavioral issues, whatever the case is. And, you know, there was a moment out in Gilchrist County where there was a grandfather that was raising all these young kids, mixed race, right? Wasn't sure about how that was all gonna go and what that meant to him. Didn't even have time to stop to make meaning of that and process it and deal with his own prejudices, right? And so, in the best possible way, at a time when this man's grandson came through a particular process of growing, of coming into a new understanding about something, he said to me, in the most honest way, and I come down from New York, right? I grew up in Brooklyn, came down here, went to school up in Boston, and came here, and he said, you know, you're okay for a colored fellow. And that was 1999, right? So it wasn't decades and decades ago. And I understood that in that moment as a real expression that was coming through layers of historical context, right? So that's what we're trying to get to here, right? This understanding that you have, that Dr. Hunt is talking about in terms of, who was the person again that you had asked about? Isaac O. So I know a little bit about Isaac O because she told me, right? So who can fill that in a little bit? How do you relate Isaac O to the character of Omar, even Naya, in this particular play? You know? Man, those finals are coming up soon, guys. What are you going to do with that? The pressure will be on, right? Anyway.
Isaac O was a patient in 1931 in Nigeria, and he was finally diagnosed with acute mania. But clearly, he was responding to a very complex colonial context of racialized hate, and it was also he was in and out of schools. There were sort of expectations for him to succeed in school, and today the acute mania, they would call it bipolar, but there was kind of a violent side that came out of him, a kind of rage. And it's a stretch, but it's a parallel. There's a parallel between colonial Africa and, the U.S. South today in terms of what it means to deal with forms of racism, and then how that then produces, a kind of anger that then can be applied to it as a diagnostic category. Acute mania, schizophrenia. We heard several of them throughout the play. How the psychiatric category comes into play in relationship to what's going on.
Yeah.
And
There was a lot of sadness. Melancholy is sadness or depression.
Mhm.
That was they're more the women characters tonight.
Right.
So.
And actually, Kirby's character Dune speaks to that. He actually refers to it as the legacy.
Yeah.
He does. He speaks to that as our legacy. I can definitely relate. growing up, black man in the South.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the messages, we tell our story. And, I grew up hearing my parents' story. I am the first generation, in my family, first generation outside of segregation. So both my parents grew up in a segregated South, having to know their places. So when, it came time for me to go to school, I had to learn their history. I had to learn what it was like to, how I should conduct myself. I had to understand that there was a double standard in our society. I mean, I had to be educated in my culture and in our history before I can even walk out the front door and just know that I was going to be bombarded by a lot of these things. So I can imagine what a young black person is going through who's growing up in Omari's case, where he or she has to learn all these other things, all of our history, and at the same time deal with all of this new stuff that's coming at them. I mean, it's like, my mind just goes, whoa, because at one point I used to think to myself, oh, well, I would see a young person in Omari's case or Jasmine's case, and I'd say, oh, well, just get off your butt and, just deal with it, But no, it's like, I think it becomes really more intense for the younger generation. And that's how I'm seeing it. So, and I don't know, because, Kevin, you're the youngest one in the cast here with us.
I mean,
Yeah,
I feel like growing up, being a black child, I mean, my parents really never sat me down, okay, listen, you're gonna be they never did that, but what Jasmine's character says, you can smell when you don't make sense to somebody. And that's what I experienced. Even when I didn't know what it was, I knew it was something. And that's what a lot of, I feel like, black youth go through. But then, Omari, in his case, like Naya said, I have tried to shield you and da-da-da-da. So she has done a good job with shielding this boy from all of that. Him being thrown into this situation, I think, is a point in our lives where it's direct to us. It's our coming of age, so how we experience it and what we're gonna do with it. And for Amari's case, because she's an educator, so he knows, he knows how to act. He knows how to, he's a good boy. He's a good kid, but he was thrown in a situation, and he had to. And that's the experiences that y'all are getting. It's him going through his life, and it's really the woke moment for him. Because we had it I had it at a young age, not as Amari, because I was a ballet dancer. I studied ballet, that's what I did as a kid. I learned really quickly that I was different in the room. Y'all feel what I'm saying? It's not because I was a boy, but because of something, because there's an elephant in the room. And that's, I feel like a lot of people get that, and that's why I say Omari's a complex character. He's not that simple. Because it's not a simple thing. These are people. These are real people. They go through things. And that's what I loved about it, is that it's just there. And you guys can take it. Like how Omari took what happened and he found his way. So now you guys have a chance to listening to it and finding, ways, how you guys look at things. You know what I'm saying?
Leo just put out a good point. He said, you could smell when you don't make sense to somebody, and that really hit me, because I'm thinking back to my freshman year in college. I was heavily involved with a white woman at that point in time, and her father was extremely racist and all, but he masked it. So literally, she would show me text messages where her father would say the N-word, all this, and he hates X, Y, Z. And one day he owns a very popular bagel shop. I just walked up in his bagel shop, he ordered food, and I could sense that vibe. But he still took care of me, excellent customer service, all the extra stuff. But literally his eyes and all, I saw the hate and tension. And then once again, now if you knew your daughter was involved with a black man, it would have been woo. He probably would have ballistic, but that was my first encounter of holy sheesh, this is an issue that's out there. and then it's masked a lot of the time. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there since you can smell when you don't make sense to somebody.
Yeah, but sometimes it doesn't have to really be about like you can know your history because I mean we're kind of forced, but it's kind of something that kind of comes up our history of like what happened or whatever the case. But I feel like it's more being aware. It's just like it's you can read all the things you want to read, but like I mean it's just like that's what about these people. I mean they're just everyday people. It's not. I mean yeah, she's a teacher. Yeah, she's educated. You know. But I mean, it's just being aware. There's nothing that Omar, because he had that situation, because his mom is an educated woman, that I mean, it's gonna happen, you know. So I just feel like it's just about being aware, you know, into that, you know.
And then there's only a certain amount of time that your parents can shield you from all that. You get to a certain age and point, you're gonna go out in the world and you just gotta be able to deal with this and move forward. You know, like, you know, as a black man, I'm not gonna say I experienced it a lot, I know, but I know it's out there, but I don't let myself get too, you know, caught up in it. No, I'm just trying to be the best person I can be, and all, so.
Yeah, because I had more of a question with the topic of madness, rage, anger. I was telling the rest of the cast backstage that with everything that's played, everything I'm like, oh my god, it's so good, it's so true, it's so relevant, I totally get it. But then there's this one line that has been really bothersome for me, and it's the line that Naya says when she says that like the rage is inherent, like it's an inheritance, and just hearing like a little bit about like madness and like the long history of that. I think it's, I'm very curious as to know like the definition that you guys are using to describe madness, rage, all of that, because I think that for me, there was definitely a little bit of, I don't know, like reluctance to like fully accept just that line in the script, because as a black woman, there are so many stereotypes about our terms of expression. So, you know, we talked last week just about Jasmine, how she's very forthright and aggressive and assertive in her language. And to a lot of people who are not used to, you know, African-American vernacular English, or just like the cultural expression of being like in your face and very direct communication, she can be seen as someone who is filled with rage or angry or whatever. She's not angry, she's just frustrated and she's hormonal and she's a teenager. She happens to be black, and so a lot of these expressions are very different and kind of atypical to what mainstream media kind of puts forth. So I guess, you know, being a black woman and being very sensitive to the stereotypes regarding like angry black woman, hostile black man, there's so much aggression, there's so much, you know, just like rage. I'm very curious as to know how those things relate to those stereotypes, and what's kind of the space where there is space to recognize that the emotion that comes forth, oftentimes in people of color, comes from desperation, depression, you know, extreme burden, like just like a very like heavy life. How is that different from the expressions of rage and madness that you guys are learning about?
And how much it applies to the situation and what exactly you're looking at. So you can't really take it across time and keep one definition. It'll always be changing along with how history is always changing, and as we move forward, different things are created, different social environments are created. And I think this production really strikes that example, one of those examples, and the many ways that oppression has been seen in society over the years. And I don't really know what else to tell you. I don't know what else to say.
I mean, I would say, that was good.
Yeah.
I would say that, okay, another hand.
Yeah, it's like in some cases, like madness is just like rage and anger, and then in others, it's like some people would consider panic disorder madness because it's like a psychological disorder. And yeah, there's just a lot of different definitions, and it really depends on the context.
But sometimes the madness is in the milieu. Sometimes it's in the context. And so it's, you know, the pipeline that we have at this point in this country is producing a kind of madness with so many black men going off to jail. And you can see, I mean, there was a madness, one could say, to the slave trade, right? So it wasn't perceived that way at the time. And then I'll just make one more comment, which is this week we read Winnicott. Winnicott is a British child psychoanalyst, and one of his big remarks is he talks about the relationship between the mother and child, how the mother has to be a good enough mother. He's back in the 50s. There's no men or fathers inside his world of who's in charge of kids. But there's also the sense that which came through very strongly in the play, that if the larger context has to hold you, if the larger context is pathological, that then people suffer and people go wrong inside that context. And so a racist school where the child is being attacked and pointed out by the teacher, there's something pathological in that. And that kid was being rational to try to tell that story to his mother. His mother, for some reason, was unable to get it, But I also thought that the contrast between the two young characters, the couple, why is it that it's the woman who's the healthy one? So we don't learn about her family. What is that larger context there? But to me, it was you were like a street version of Michelle Obama. I will call a spade, I'll name my rage. I'll name my rage. I'll tell you how it is, and just very wise. You were like the wise figure of the play. I've said enough.
Is there a hand back here?
Amanda.
Me, yes. Hi. Sadowski was a doctor that analyzed Isaac O. He said that part of Isaac O's issue was that he was taken away from his homeland and thrown into a whole new environment, perspective, people, and a lot of the times our parents try to push us, like in this example, to move forward into a better world or into a better school, but sometimes that's more harmful because we do not fit in and we do not understand, and with the lack of understanding yields frustration. And I think that is where a lot of rage and anger can come from, just internalized, not necessarily, obviously across all races and genders, but just as part of humans, we are trying to understand the world, and I think that's part of where the rage comes from, not understanding.
Very nice. So Naya, what's up? Why did you have to force Omari into this terrible situation? Brad.
Well, I like hearing that last comment perfectly, because that's kind of driving upon the thing that drives my idea of where these characters get their confusion, their anger, their rage, any of that. And for me, when the young lady back there said, put into a totally different world, some place that they're not used to, what that struck me as being is that as children, all of us, up until a certain level, are basically what we would call innocent. And that innocence for a white person in our community, in our society, gets chopped down in little tiny compartmentalized areas of our life. We might hit that day when we realize we're no longer an athlete, and that little tiny part of our life is different now. We hit that time when we find, like this little thing in our life might not work. Somebody calls me a name and suddenly that friendship has to go away. What I kind of see through this story and dozens of others is that there's a time in the life of a black child where they have to realize that half the world is against them. Do you hear that silence? What if you had to suddenly figure out that half the world was against your existence on a level playing field with them? That's more than stubbing your toe. That's more than breaking your leg. That's more than falling out of a tree. It's more than losing a parent. That's your life is suddenly something completely different that you never knew was there. And you have to live in that. And for me, that just, if nothing else is going to define white privilege, it's that. I don't have to live through that. And that's not fair. And that sit down and talk with a child to try to tell them of the dangers that Naya talks about in scene 5 with Jasmine. Do you know what it's like to send your son out there every day? Like, that talk happens in situations all over. You know, and I'm not saying that it's absolutely 100% unique to black students, obviously black children, black whatever, but I'm just saying that that's something that's way bigger, and I think that that probably has, I mean, when you add that into our, you know, you don't like the word, but, you know, inheritance, you know? It's like bringing it all up again. It's making all that happen again. And that hurts. I mean, it hurts me, but, you know.
You know, a few weeks ago, Brad asked, he said, he was like, man, you know what, I'll never really know how it feels to be black or just go through the black experience and all. And it is nerve-wracking at times. Like, for instance, a few weeks ago, I got a ticket, and I shared the story with Teresa. Instantly in my mind, the cop pulled me over. I didn't know all the specifics regarding the move-over law and things like that, but I got a ticket for that. But instantly when he pulled me over, I dropped all my windows, and I just immediately, I couldn't hear him, so I immediately put my hands out the window. And then I still couldn't hear him, so I got out the car, just stayed on top until I got it, like this all clear signal from him to move forward and all. So, like I was saying before, at times it can be nerve-wracking, because you're always a man. As I move up, like, am I gonna, you know, possibly be killed just because of my color or what? So that thought always lingers behind our head sometimes, so FYI.
How's your hand back here? Oh, please, go for it.
I think there's another dimension to the story of not belonging, not only by race, but also by nationality. There are a lot of immigrants. I know that I share that with people in my classroom. I'm not from here. This is not my first language. And sitting in a classroom at a very young age, looking at the board and not understanding what's on it, and being laughed at for it, you grow very quickly, and you understand that you have to fight a bigger battle than everyone else, and you need to work twice as hard to earn the same respect. Even though in your country, you might be a lawyer, the minute you step here, you are no one, and you are nobody, and no one's going to respect you the same, because they think this place is theirs. But who took it from the natives to begin with? So there's a whole other dimension to this of not belonging, not just race, not just gender, but nationality.
It's so crazy to say that, because I just left Savannah. When I was in Savannah, I visited this place called the St. Thomas and Slave Quarters, right? I walked in there, I got to get the whole, literally is where the slaves used to live, do all that, where they work, and one of the biggest points once, oh my gosh, I'm losing my train of thought. No, where was I going? Yeah, it's been a long day, where's it going? I'll let somebody else in, and when it comes back to me, I'll pick it up.
Stephen?
No, actually, I'm glad you brought up that point that it definitely goes past race, you know, it's nationality, but it's so interesting you say that, because that's one of the lessons that we learn in black communities, is that we're taught we have to be just as good to get at least half of what our white counterparts have. Twice as good, really, to get just get half of what our white counterparts. So can you imagine the pressure, you know? And like you said, and not belonging. Yeah.
And to have to hear that from your parents has got to be disorienting and just disillusioning. I mean, could you imagine, you know?
Uh-huh.
I feel like there's an aspect of, if you are good enough, like if you work twice as hard, people were surprised. Because like I've had people come up to me saying that I speak white, and I'm like, what are you talking about? And they'll be like,
what is white?
Yeah, and they'll be like you don't have an accent and you don't talk like you're ghetto, and I'm like, what? Like I speak eloquently, why is that a problem? Like, isn't that what you expect of me? But when you play into the expectations, it's like, why are you doing that?
Right. Yeah.
And so everybody who responds to that in a weird way is like, I suddenly don't know how to take you.
Yeah.
Well, that meant that you were taking her before you knew her.
Something that you guys talked about, like, just feeling foreign, especially with the way that you speak, because I love that this play brought forth Gwendolyn Brooks, who is fantastic, and there was the contrast between the way that it's written as she intended and the way that it's written in these textbooks that are, published and produced by, mainstream white normative culture. And so there's this issue also, with Black Americans, I know in particular, who have the issue of code switching. And so while it's not a different language entirely, African American vernacular English has, it's a completely different system, has its own syntax, and there's actually a legit way of that the syntax forms, and there's a right and there's a wrong way. And African American vernacular English is looked down upon, it's so frowned upon, and so I know that me as a child, I grew up in Liberty City. If you know Miami, you know you don't want to go there at night. And I grew up in this place where all of the kids, looked like me or lighter shades of me, and we spoke, hood slang, African American vernacular English, Spanish, Spanglish, all of that, Creole. And I remember I started getting into oratorical contests, which are just learn very long speeches and then compete and say them. And I had this speech coach, and we would have to go through, and she would teach me, help me so that I could compete. And I remember we had this one session, I was in 4th grade, and I had to say the word ASK, which I know how to say now because I was traumatized. And so I said axe. This is a very common way that Black Americans say that word. And so my teacher or the coach looks at me and she's like, no, it's ask. The S is before the K. And I was like, what the heck? What's happening? Why is my world changing so quickly? And so I remember it was ask and desks. And so it was this really humiliating way. I was a really great reader. I was a star student, and yet this teacher was kind of reteaching me how to speak in a way that was acceptable so that I could win this, great prize of $50 and a Pizza Hut coupon. And so there is this otherness that people feel, whether they are from a different country or not. And I know that me as a Black American, I definitely feel that way. And I just want to say that, code switching, I was a teacher over at PACE, Center for Girls, for a while, and it was something that I encourage my students to do. It takes a huge ability for students to be able to code switch, to know when to be able to go back to their native dialect, accent, whatever that is, language, and then to be able to come back into mainstream normative culture and speak in a way that is acceptable and heard and understood. So I really liked that in Naya's lesson, there was the comparison between the two, because our language, our accent, it's a place of belonging, and so I really liked that Jasmine kind of kept that. She refused to be assimilated into this culture that she was kind of shoved into. And I really liked that, you compare her to Michelle Obama, because I think that it's so uncommon that we see a character like Jasmine who talks the way that she does and can still be, and it was one of the things I remember having a conversation with Leo and Amanda. It's like, I don't know if people will be able to see Jasmine and hear her and still think that she is intelligent and kind and compassionate and smart and wise, because usually when we see these kinds of characters, they are not intelligent and kind and compassionate and wise. And so that really was very heartwarming, so thank you very much.
So let's bring this home, okay? There's a lot that's been said that's really, there's a lot of intersectionality here today. One thing that was really on my mind as we approached this nexus of everything that you guys are going through in terms of your studies, the kind of awareness you're building, and the kind of awareness this cast, this director, and this creative director of this space has brought into this community is kind of a lesser seen narrative. The kind of notoriety of how underserved Black American communities are, especially relative to mental health care, right? And if we can kind of try and pull that red thread through everything that we've experienced today, and I'm about to put your professor on the spot here. So, Nancy, what do you think relative to the outcomes of this kind of messaging, this play, this kind of awareness that it brings out? Is there a pathway forward, especially through creative arts like this, performative arts, to bring this kind of idea into, as you say, to kind of shift the milieu, right? To bring a new awareness, to say that sometimes madness occurs because we are forced to occupy different identity spaces. And that's just what we're forced to do in terms of our normal lives, whereas other members of our community may not be, right? So could that be something that is, that could lend itself to a pathway that could be diagnostic? I mean, in terms of understanding rage, understanding resentment, understanding lashing out, and not letting it be something that is generalized or stereotyped, but rather something individuated. So, please.
I don't know if I can do a good, quick answer to that,
Oh, yeah.
but I think, the more that mental health care comes from the grassroots up inside our worlds, the better off one is. The moment you invite psychiatrists in with their diagnoses and their medications, which is not to say medications sometimes are not really important, but I have one foot always in the anti-psychiatry camp, because I think especially in poor Black communities that kind of stuff can do a lot of trouble. So what did strike me, the other thing that struck me in the play in terms of the script is just these two schools, and so your class issues are continually there, and when should I place my kid in the white school so they can get ahead, and when is it actually better for their self-esteem and for their morale to keep them in a more kind of ghetto school. And my few experiences with the East Side school, which has got both layered on top of each other in the same building in this very bizarre way, is that that those Black, the more I've come to be in the Deep South too, I've wondered about just how the fact that there's a gift in the fact that these communities remain in part very segregated. People have their communities, they have their spaces. They might be very poor spaces, but they've got each other. And so that's just, me coming in as an outsider, not knowing much about how that actually works on the ground. Because I know those neighborhoods can also go toxic and be quite dangerous and not at all be good for mental health. But I'm not sure the route of mainstreaming people into the more privileged schools is always best so I don't know. There's a tension in the play. There's a tension in my mind around those issues. It's wonderful to have African American kids in my classrooms at the University of Florida, those who made it and are there and are doing it, and had whatever things happened well at home, and they're succeeding. So and I don't always see much beyond that. So.
Professor Nancy, thank you very much for coming.
All of you and all my students who came.
I know, I don't know if it's inappropriate to refer as the madness cohort.
It is the madness cohort.
Thank you very much. Again, our director, Dr. Litz, and our assistant director of the Actors Warehouse,